Hello everyone, I'm Thomas Raymond and welcome to our new podcast, Ultra-Real Criminology, the 21st century criminology podcast. And on this podcast, we're going to be exploring everything to do with ultra-realist criminology. Ultra-realism is a new or a relatively new and exciting theoretical framework for making sense of crime and harm in contemporary global society. But it's also a theoretical approach that is quite unfamiliar, both to students and to academics alike. Its underlying academic influences are often quite different to the ideas that we typically see within criminology and which students learn in textbooks, as it draws on ideas from contemporary continental philosophy, theoretical psychoanalysis, among others. As such, some of its ideas and some of its claims are often misunderstood, and those who draw on ultra-realism have found that newcomers to this perspective can find its material slightly bewildering. So we consider this podcast as a kind of guide for the bewildered, a guide for those who are interested in ultra-realism and interested in what it's got to say, but who are perhaps slightly uncertain or unclear as to what it's all about. So episodes will be dedicated to making sense of ultra-realism by speaking to guests who are either explicitly working from this position or who are perhaps just drawing on some of its ideas selectively. And we'll also spend time as well, not just talking about ultra-realism, but talking about crime, justice, criminology and academic life more generally, drawing on kind of current events of the day. Our first episode is going to be organised around the question, why ultra-realism? Why do we need a new theoretical framework within criminology? And to help us in answering this question, we're joined by Professor Simon Winlow of Northumbria University, one of the founders of ultra-realism, on this first episode of the pod. So without further ado, we'll switch over to our chat with Simon now. Please don't forget to give us a like and hit the subscribe button. We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Ultra-Real Criminology, the 21st century criminology podcast. I'm Thomas Raymond and I'm hosting this podcast today alongside Anthony Lloyd of Teesside University, who's joining us from Middlesbrough. You're joining us from Middlesbrough, aren't you?
I am, yes.
Yeah, somewhere around there, isn't it? Usually we'd be joined as well by Professor James Treadwell of Staffordshire University, but he's in Guildford because he's the only one of us who decided to attend this year's British Society of Criminology conference. So the first episode of this new podcast is all about why ultra-realism? Why do we need a new theoretical framework within criminology, and kind of what's wrong with what we've already got, and how does ultra-realism help us build on some of that? And to help us kind of answer that question, we're very privileged to have Professor Simon Winlow of Northumbria University joining us today. Simon, welcome.
Lovely to see you both. Thank you for inviting me.
No, you're absolutely welcome. So, for those of you who don't know all about Simon, he's been for the last 20 odd years been doing ethnographic research in kind of deindustrialized zones of the north of England. He's done work on bouncers, violence, local entrepreneurial criminality. More recently has been doing work on the far right and writing on politics more generally. He's considered probably one of the founding fathers of ultra-realist criminology alongside his longtime friend and colleague, Professor Steve Hall. And he's the author of kind of numerous books and articles, links to which are some of which are in the notes below. So, Simon, I'll dive right in really, and I'm kind of interested to. We'll get into some of the details of ultra-realism and some of its kind of core claims and ideas and concepts. But before we do, I just kind of want to explore your own background and your own journey in life and academia. And I asked that not kind of as a shallow and superficial kind of biographical exercise that these kind of interviews always kind of have, but more purposeful in terms of how you arrived at that feeling that criminology needed a new theoretical perspective. So if you could talk a little bit about your own journey and kind of how and why and when you felt like something like ultra-realism was necessary.
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in the wonderful city of Sunderland, working class family, respectable working class. I did pretty good at school, not great. I stumbled through A levels and arrived at the University of Durham, which, as you'll both know, is a kind of, well, a very unusual for someone of my background to be thrust into that environment. Very posh, very formal, and obviously a working class guy in that environment, you feel quite, you know, a little unsure of yourself. But I slowly got very interested in sociology. The sociology degree at Durham at that time, well, this is going back many years, and you know, the lecturing style, the content of your curriculum was much more informal, probably a degree less rigorous than students undertaking sociology degrees today would pass through. But I orientated myself to a guy called Professor Dick Hobbs, who was a sociologist, criminologist, and also a working class guy. You could have a joke, and you know, you could have a little bit of banter with him. It wasn't all presentation, and I was greatly interested in his ethnographic work, and he'd done stuff with professional criminals in the East End of London. Really excellent stuff, very well regarded, and my general abiding view was that I could do that. You know, I knew criminals of all kinds, various what sociologists would call deviant populations who were some way from mainstream civil society. I could go and talk to them and gather that kind of data, and I knew about how criminal markets worked. I was the kind of postgrad student at Durham, you know, if someone wanted to buy something dodgy, they'd ask me, and I could probably get it for them. I knew criminals working in all kinds of different spheres.
Like the Mackham Delboy.
You know, I brought that experience. Yeah, well, kind of, yeah. I mean, just a little bit of profit here and there. It's the kind of what Dick called the commodification of reality. It's always trying to buy cheap and sell for, you know, buy cheap and sell for a bit more, find a little bit of profit, which is very much part of that entrepreneurial working class culture that Dick wrote so well about. So I brought a bit of that to, you know, my postgraduate studies. He said I could do it, which is a great thing to have someone as respected as Dick say, you know, you can do this. So I developed a little bit more confidence, and I became an ethnographer. But one of the great, talking about ultra-realism, one of the great shocks to the system of slowly becoming acclimatized to that elite educational environment is that I found a lot of the core explanatory theory in social science. So mostly I'm talking about sociology and criminology, but also a lot of social policy, social work, those kinds of disciplines. It was, those explanatory frameworks tended to be diffuse with, you know, really basic idealism, which misrepresented the world as I understood it. And I kind of was interested in it because lots of these lecturers were kind of lefties, and they would talk about capitalist economy, and they would talk about exploitation, which I'm very interested in. But then they'd present lots of the criminals as some kind of Robin Hood figures who are fighting against capitalist authoritarianism, which I just thought was nuts. And, you know, I knew that that's not how it worked out on the streets. And it's not that the criminals I knew were more instrumental in their orientation to criminal activity. It's criminals generally were, I had never met an idealistic, anti-capitalist criminal who was, engaged in kind of bog standard criminal activity. So I decided that, we need new ideas. And I later, as a postgrad student, got to work with Steve Hall. You mentioned a project on bouncers there. We began to do work on masculinity and gender and crime, physicality and occupational culture and violence. And so we started to bounce ideas off one another. And Steve at that time was, very, very talented theorist, great with abstract thought. And I was the one who kind of went out and got the data. And we developed slowly from there. And we were always outsiders. I think we thought of ourselves as outsiders. And we always believed that we could produce something a little bit more rigorous and a little bit more insightful to explain why crime occurs. And especially in the kind of areas that we researched, which are very high crime areas. And not just high in terms of recorded crime, but huge levels of underreported, unrecorded crime that goes on every day out there in the real world, and which lots of university lecturers simply never encounter in their day-to-day lives. They have no idea about levels of, I don't know, on a council estate or kind of bullying, low-level antisocial behaviour, street drinking, about what that works, how that affects people as they go about their daily lives. People don't encounter it. They can't see how it's a problem. So it never really finds its way into the mainstream of the discipline. So ultra-realism is just an attempt to explain crime better. And that, sorry, go for it.
No, that's fine.
True.
I was just going to kind of dig into, you talked about that kind of when you encountered some of the sociology and criminology lecturers and some of their ideas and stuff they were drawing upon, this kind of romanticism of the criminal figure or deviant figure, and this kind of like almost this naive idealism that was kind of that you felt is permeating the discipline. Where does that come from? Why is there this desire to romanticize and kind of paint these figures in a way that is, from your perspective, completely different from reality? What's going on there?
Well, idealism obviously has a very deep current, intellectual current that really runs from philosophy and moves outwards throughout the social sciences and humanities. But a lot of it in criminology, especially, is underdogism. It's based around a kind of, totally unproblematic desire, political desire to stand up for those populations who are perceived as being, not having a voice. They're being subjugated or oppressed in some way. They're unfairly targeted by the police, or, they haven't had legitimate opportunities to succeed. So, lots of that idealist criminology is a challenge to conventional forms of explanation. The way that things are is unfair. And, that unfairness is reflected in crime and justice, the whole field of crime and justice and, policy issues and things like that. And so I think a lot of it is, and God bless them, I think we should stand up for the underdog. However, for me, I was always far more interested in accurately reflecting reality than taking an underdog position, which I see is a kind of refutation of the goal, the fundamental reason we become social scientists, which is to explain something or to reveal something that is hidden, to know the world better. Whereas I think in many cases, kind of idealist criminologists are really not doing that. They're rather, taking a partial position. They're taking a side, and they're not trying to produce an objective explanation. They're trying to defend the interests of particular cohorts in the broader population. And I think that's a laudable political goal, but I don't think it's particularly laudable for social scientists to be so dedicated to a political position that it encourages them to misrepresent what's actually going on there out in the world.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back to the politics thing a little bit later in the pod. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I'm always interested in how people kind of arrive at ultra-realism. There's this idea that everyone who draws an ultra-realism began their careers as ultra-realists, as it were, kind of quote unquote. And for me, that wasn't the case at all. I'd never heard of yourself or Steve as an undergraduate. The stuff that got me into criminology was the cultural criminology stuff, which was kind of the resistance through rituals stuff, kind of, revisited, the likes of Jeff Ferrell and Keith Hayward's early work. And when I was doing my PhD, and it was all kind of around, contestation around urban space, looking at parkour and free running, and I was desperate to kind of find this resistance that everyone was speaking about. I was expecting to find these kind of politically motivated young people out there, reclaiming urban space and doing all the rest of it, and it just wasn't there. When I went out into the field and started looking, it just wasn't there. I just did not see it. And so that was kind of how I stumbled across your work, was because I was reading up on all this material on resistance, and I stumbled across, old Winlow and Hall, and you wrote quite critically of resistance at that time, kind of in the mid 2000s. And I thought, oh, this is good. This has got something to say. I kind of went with it from there. So I think it's interesting to kind of always look at how people arrive at certain theoretical commitments, and that actually oftentimes they emerge from encounters with reality that don't chime with kind of existing accounts.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I was obviously one of Simon's students as an undergrad and as a PhD student, and I was either naive or hadn't been paying attention. But when I was doing my call center research, I was looking for active resistance in the call center and just couldn't see it. And it's that encounter with reality where so actually, if I'm not finding the thing that I'm seeing everywhere else in the literature, then you need to find another way of explaining it. And that's where I think, for me, some of those, being able to apply some of those concepts, obviously, Simon's work was on violence and masculinity and deindustrialized areas. I was looking at kind of post-industrial service economy, but it translated because I wasn't seeing what all of the literature told me I should be seeing in that data.
Yeah, because you started out quite, Simon, you drew on your early work, Badfellas, which is for people who haven't read it and are listening, is a terrific ethnography. If you want to see how ethnography should be done, it's an absolutely cracking bit of ethnography to read. But your work, that early work, was quite Bourdieusian, wasn't it? You drew on Pierre Bourdieu quite a great deal. How did you're obviously now quite a ways away from that and have been for some time. How did you move from, that material to where you are now, which is drawing on the kind of continental philosophy and theoretical psychoanalysis and all the rest of it? Can you talk us through that journey?
Yeah, I think it's just always been, I mentioned there about trying to know the world better. And, as you write books and articles and whatever else, if you've got any sense, you'll critically appraise your own work and ask how your explanation could have been better and try and identify where the weaknesses are. And I think I've always been able to, be fairly objective judge of my own work. And those early books, for example, I was applying ideas that just seemed the best able to shed the most light on the forms of crime that I was reporting in that ethnographic study. But of course, then I was in my 20s. I did a lot more reading. Bourdieu was interesting and seemed to shed a lot more light than standard sociological theories around environment on why particular men became involved in criminal markets. So I used that kind of sociology very early on, and then gradually began to move away from it as I became acquainted with other ideas. So I never would have thought that I would become interested in theoretical psychoanalysis. As you're probably aware, in sociology and criminology, psychoanalysis has a very poor reputation because the assumption is that it's always it deals only with individual pathology, and it can't have any broad explanatory value when you're looking at general social trends. But of course, as you begin to get involved in the literature, it becomes seductive and interesting, and you can see how those ideas can illuminate the the work that you've done, out talking to criminals and what have you. And in particular, the work of Zizek was important, and I read Zizek before I read Freud and Lacan, which is an odd way to do it. I think it's a lot to do with Zizek's style, especially his work that was published at the turn of the century, because he's such an overtly dialectical thinker. He very usefully employs these reversals. And he, the standard one about Bourdieusian sociologists who would say, well, Bourdieusian sociologists will say, and make a very strong argument, and then the reader's saying, yes, I agree that that's a reasonable explanation. And then he does the, but what if? And then reverses things backwards and offers you the alternative perspective and encourages you to rethink the problem with a new range of ideas. And I think that's, especially when I got into reading, Freud is a beautiful writer, really very well organized writer. But some of Lacan's points can be jarring and pull you up short, which I also enjoyed. Not a great writer, certainly not the craftsman that Freud is. But these authors should allow you a greater conceptual range, new tools. That's what they're really offering you, that allow you to set about the task of better explaining social reality. So I thought I dove into that and submerged myself in a lot of that material, and then gradually kind of grew in confidence that I had it within me to start producing my own concepts and my own original work in a field which I had not been socialized in at all.
So I guess as a kind of lead on from that first question, we've kind of taken a few tangents, but in terms of, you've discussed what you felt was some of the inadequacies of the existing ideas that you were doing. You're looking at the inadequacies of your own work, how you felt that you could have just done things a little bit better. So as a lead on from that, how then would you describe kind of ultra-realism? What are some of its kind of key features? And how, in your eyes, do those key features address some of the issues that you've already discussed?
Well, I think at the core of it is this drive to try and know the world better. And ultra-realism is, from my perspective at least, quite different to other comparable schools in sociology and criminology, in that it invites better ideas to overtake it. I'm not here to defend ultra-realism till I'm blue in the face. If you've got a better idea, that allows me to see social reality in more detail, to understand why people behave in the way that they do, to understand the foundations of social behavior and how we live together. If you've got a better idea, a better range of ideas, I'm happy to adopt your ideas and move forward. I'm not slavishly committed to defending the ideas that I've promulgated. And I invite the next generation of sociologists and criminologists to overtake my limited accomplishments, and I'm happy to be lost in history in that respect. And I think a lot of academics of my generation in particular, maybe generation above mine, they come up with an idea and then they spend the next 30 years of their career defending it or trying to refine it in some way, rather than just doing the brave thing, which is to let it go and try and produce something else. So, I'm committed to social science, to understanding how the world works in all its myriad forms and all the different aspects. And I look forward to people teaching me something. And I'm perfectly happy to dispense with ultra-realism as soon as you've identified a better idea. Now, the problem is, I'm a pretty tough judge. I'm perfectly happy to be a critical judge of my own work, but I will also critically interrogate new work that's brought to the table. Because I'm fundamentally committed to knowing the world better, I'm not willing to deploy an idea just because, it seems to have a little bit of function here and there, and, it might be quite useful for explaining this specific problem. I wanted to give it a good shake, see what the idea can really tell us. I want to think about where the idea comes from, what ideas it's borrowing from, what are its history, what is its philosophical foundations. So I'm an ultra-realist in the extent that I'm a committed social scientist, and I want to know the world better. And I think at the moment, ultra-realism offers us a range of opportunities to push beyond the cloying sensitivities of liberal social science and actually look at the real world and think about why people behave in ways that damage other people and the environments that we share. Why do people do that? And this is my real motivation. I think ultra-realism gives students, social scientists generally speaking, a range of conceptual tools that allow them to come to know the world better.
So to pick up on that, Simon, the question there is, why do people willingly inflict harm on others? And I would agree, obviously, but I would agree that that's probably the most fundamental question that we should be asking. It does seem, though, that that's an increasingly minor concern within criminology, asking that question about why. And I guess my question back to you is why is that the case? Why does the discipline increasingly move away from asking that? It seems so fundamentally important to be able to answer that, and it increasingly doesn't ask it. What are your thoughts on why that is?
Yeah, I think, well, when I first moved into criminology, there was still a substrata of the discipline which was interested in motivation and wanted to explain why people, the forces that drove people forwards to commit particular acts. And this was usually defined in the types of crime that you were analysing. So motivations to engage in fraud were different from motivations to engage in violence. But motivation kind of disappeared from the discipline. It kind of dropped out somewhere in the 1990s. And now you see virtually nothing written about actual motivations. And I think this is to do with the general transformation of social science. And, think about an archetypal social scientist. I'll tell you what, like someone like Talcott Parsons, whose work I really don't rate too much, but he's the archetypal, the quintessential social scientist, because he builds a system to explain how and why people behave out there in the real world. And it's not a very good one, but he invites criticism. And of course, there's a huge amount of criticism being leveled at Parsons' work. But that's a contribution to social science, not because of any, the gravitas of what he had to say or how illuminating it was, but rather that it invited forms of critique, which could then move the discipline forward. Those kinds of dialectical structures, I don't think are present in social science today in anything like the same way. And I think, I mentioned politics before, but part of that process, the internal disciplinary process, is about people seeing themselves less and less as objective social scientists committed to truth, and more about activists who are defending marginalized social groups. And I think increasingly, people will find various social groups that need to be defending. As I said, there are many good reasons to do that, but that's a political undertaking rather than a necessarily social scientific undertaking. And so lots of the, if you look at the core journals, for example, they'll say, I don't know, stop and search or something like that, or some kind of victimized population. And the basic essence of all those papers is to say that something's unfair. The world is unfair. And over again in sociology and criminology, we hear the same story: the world is unfair. And I have to be honest, I kind of came to that conclusion like just as I left senior school. I knew the world was unfair. Obviously, the world is unfair. So repeating over and over again tonelessly that the world is unfair really doesn't seem to have any forward momentum. I don't think it's taking us anywhere productive or intellectually interesting. We're just becoming more refined in explaining how the world is unfair, rather than trying to move towards forms of knowledge which might allow us to overcome those forms of unfairness. So I think, the kind of rise of activism, if anyone's an activist, I applaud your political commitment. If you spend your weekends going on marches, calling for social justice, calling for an end to oppressive police practices or something like that, I think that's great. But I think, Monday to Friday, I think we should be engaged in more traditionally intellectual pursuits, which seek to explain why people act the way they do, explain why they're willing to harm one another, how the motivation to actually take pleasure from damaging another person, or how one can set aside traditional forms of morality and believe that they are effectively doing good by pursuing their own instrumental self-interest. These are interesting questions, and I think they need to be addressed objectively rather than with that kind of activist mentality.
So on that note, kind of, what are then some of ultra-realism's key features that distinguish it and allow it to explain? You're saying that ultra-realism is all about the why, the motivation. Why are people willing to harm others, commit crime in order to benefit itself? So what are some of ultra-realism's key features that allow it to explain these things in a way that distinguishes it from, say, the traditional models that we've got around? I know it's got influences within left realism, but things like strain theory, or like techniques of neutralization or labeling theory, or whatever. If you had to kind of describe what ultra-realism is in that way, how would you go about doing that?
Well, I don't want to complicate it too much, but I mean, the key division is between ultra-realism's epistemological framework and its ontological framework. So in terms of its epistemology, it offers a kind of gradients of reality, a framework that allows you to grasp the probabilistic contexts that make crime and harm more probable. So, we borrow quite a bit from Bhaskar, or at least use Bhaskar as an inspiration to develop the model. And very often explanations for crime or violence or whatever it might be are kind of stuck at the surface empirical level. So it's, an empirical description of how crimes or violence, whatever it is you're interested in, plays out on the day-to-day level. Ultra-realism then proposes we dig beneath that empirical level. Beneath the empirical level is the actual level, where you find a variety of social forces that frame events at the empirical level. Well, ultra-realists want to drive a good deal further than that. We want to dig down to the core, where the fundamental forces that shape our society to be found. And I think this offers us the opportunity to more accurately contextualize crime and violence, to explain the variety of forces that bear down upon the world and shape all of our behaviors, and not just the way that we behave, but the way we think about ourselves, internal internally, not just our behavior in the external world, but what's going on internally within ourselves. And that takes us on to the ontological framework, which is about how consciousness, how greatly reliant upon forms of psychoanalysis, of course, how consciousness shapes our social behavior, our orientation to the world, our orientation towards other people. Are there ends or are there means? How do we engage with others? And I think, well, I'll take, if you're talking about motivation, I think, a lot of my more theoretical writing is focused on issues surrounding trauma. And so, a standard, explanation for a violent crime, I don't know, let's take a punch up in a taxi rank outside a, pub in Newcastle. Now, there are immediately a whole range of theories that could be brought to bear that would seek to capture why this particular crime took place. But I'd encourage any students or social scientists to always never fully invest in the theories and to think about how you can refine it or add to it. So, the standard one would be the feminist argument. It's about toxic masculinity, people believing that, that they have rights to jump in front of taxi rights. They're anxious about their bodily capital, about their status, and consequently they seek to dominate others. All of these are interesting kind of ideas that can be brought to bear, but there are more complex issues at stake. Another crime that you could consider more serious forms of violence. I've interviewed repeated violent offenders, a lot of repeated violent offenders who create, in terms of the sum total of violence that occurs in a city like Newcastle, repeat violent offenders, people who are fundamentally committed to an idea of themselves as being violent and willing and able to defend any challenge that comes their way. In many cases, men who adopt that kind of combative approach to social life have suffered victimization, various forms of victimization earlier in their lives. And not just physical and mental forms of cruelty in the home, although that is certainly a part of it, but the really corrosive effects of humiliation, I think, are particularly important. And, especially in psychoanalysis, I encourage students to kind of analyze their own behavior and their own response to negative events in their lives. How did it make them feel? What were the perceived outcomes? And humiliation is incredibly corrosive and damaging, and it lingers. And rather than offering a fundamentally, political feminist approach or a sociological account of flawed masculinities, I think the broad vista of ultra-realism, and especially how it borrows from theoretical psychoanalysis, allows us a greater degree of insight, a more complex reading, certainly, but complexity shouldn't scare us. I think if we're heading towards truth, we need to deploy all the tools, all the opportunities to get to it, rather than simply, defining ourselves by our disciplinary field. If I'm a sociologist, I'm going to put some Bourdieu in there. I'm going to have an account of culture and socialization. Or if I'm a political feminist, I'm going to talk about patriarchy and male dominance and whatever else. If we really want to know what's going on, objectively, we need to deploy all the tools that we have at our disposal. We need to roam quite widely. And so ultra-realism is basically, well, from my perspective, Steve might disagree, but it's about equipping people with a range of tools that they can then pick up and use and change if they need to, but to try and make sense of what's going on, what they're researching, what interests them. And I hope ultra-realism has provided some of those tools.
It's interesting listening to you talk about this, and I've heard you speak about ultra-realism a lot before, but I'm always quite taken with the fact that this is, as much as it's a call, you're simultaneously kind of saying, right, we need to look at depth structures that are shaping our world and our society. And people would say, well, a lot of criminology work's already doing that. It's looking at, patriarchy or histories of colonialism or imperialism or capitalism or whatever it might be. But what you're suggesting is that these can only give us probabilistic contexts in which things are likely to occur. It doesn't actually offer us in that sense a direct cause of this causes this. No, this makes this more likely. But what I'm getting from what you're saying is that actually we need to look at the individual a lot more closely than perhaps we've been inclined to do. Look at their individual biography, their histories, and how all of these different things kind of interact with one another, which I find quite interesting, because if you listen to certain people where they talk about the history of criminology, they'll talk about it as it's too individualistic. Its history is too individualistic. It's always been too focused upon the individual. It's not looked at these structural issues enough. And it's almost, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but it's almost like what you're saying is, no, we need to go back to the individual a little bit more, and look at them in conjunction with these kind of broad structures that we're looking at.
Absolutely, yeah. We need to have a really good look at how the individual interacts, how they're socialized, of course, but how they interact with their socioeconomic contexts, how we engage with one another, how we think and feel and react. And of course, when we say we have to look at the individual, we assume that we're talking about an individual separate from the social world. But of course, there are forms of universality, mental processes, whatever else, that are broadly experienced across, especially in particular populations. And in many cases, the thing that's judged to be individualistic, which is your psychical response to the world around you with cues out there in the real world, are actually fairly uniform across social groups. There will be idiosyncratic, the aspects of unique personality and whatever else, but there will be things that are kind of collectively experienced. And I think, hopefully what we've built is a kind of a structure that allows social scientists to get to grips with that, the individual and how they respond to their social environment. One of the standard critiques that always pisses me off about ultra-realism is that it's kind of reductive, in the sense that, when we're talking about depth structures, you say, oh, well, it's capitalism, right? And I do write a lot about capitalism, and capitalism is important. But capitalism, as you just said, just kind of provides probabilistic contexts which help to shape criminal markets and the way that we engage with one another. Helps to shape our psychology in a number of really quite significant ways. But I don't want to simply point at capitalism and say, well, it's all capitalism's fault, because that is reductive. And it's, I think, very often a deliberate misreading of what we've had to say about the importance of depth analysis.
Yeah, I'm always quite, I feel the same way in terms of that. That's a critique, or even if I don't even know if it's a critique or a misunderstanding, just because they see the work that's been done, and capitalism is quite a heavy focus. If you go back through the work that's been done from this perspective, I think we all talk about capitalism in quite a lot of depth. But then I look at, say, like your work on violent subjectivity, Tony Ellis's work on men, masculinities and violence, and capitalism is kind of actually quite deep in the background in terms of your accounts. And what you're much more focused on is the individual biographies, and you mentioned trauma earlier, in terms of explaining why do these men specifically grow up to be such compulsively violent people, when the person who lives next door to them, lives in their street that they went to school with, did not follow that same path. And so it's a really, I always think that those examples are the kind of best examples of ultra-realism at work, in terms of your connecting the deep structural issues, because you talk about, industrial histories of the North and how that shapes issues around masculinity and how children are raised and all of those kind of things, and then connect that with social change, but then personal histories of abuse and trauma. So so I always like that. So in terms of, just to clarify for listeners, would you agree with the statement when you say that ultra-realism isn't a crime causation theory? It's not a theory in the sense that labeling theory is a theory or strain theory is a theory, you know, or you've got like arguments around relative deprivation. It strikes me, it's always struck me as more of like a kind of framework that's kind of got a certain structure, but it's malleable. You can kind of move it around a little bit. It's not a kind of thing that says this causes this. Would you agree with that? Putting you on the spot here now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, it is quite loose, and I think what we've built is a kind of general framework. And you know, our great hope was always that people would add to it as we kind of move things forward. And perfectly happy to engage in kind of dialectical exchange that advances, you know, our knowledge of these issues. And so what we've got is a kind of the ontological and the epistemological frame offered by ultra-realism. And then, of course, we've got a range of concepts which I think are really useful in trying to capture, you know, a range of crime forms. And here's Steve's concept of special liberty and criminal undertaker, particularly important. And they were actually, he wrote about that kind of stuff before we actually coined the phrase ultra-realism. Mm. So, you know, it is quite a loose structure. You're talking about capitalism there, you know, and obviously I've written a good deal about trauma and how particular individuals become so deeply committed to violence that it plays a real central role in how they define themselves as an individual. And again, just, you know, as you're talking about there, the background issues of deindustrialization and the long run of history of martial cultures, physicality, the development of masculinity across, you know, hundreds, you know, centuries. And of course, this takes me actually strangely veer off towards psychoanalysis. You know, for the most part, I'm kind of a Lacanian when it comes to psychoanalysis. And the basic point is that capitalism ensures insecurity. You know, it's a system that thrives upon insecurity, especially in the post-60s global economy. It rent people free from the forms of security that they'd managed to develop and made them increasingly insecure. And insecurity was believed to be the thing that would drive people towards accumulation and economic growth and all the rest of that. But the negative effects of insecurity, I believe, are, you know, you can talk about this with students very easily. It's a very good way to get into the psychoanalytic aspects of ultra-realism. We can see the effects of insecurity every day, and if you develop an analytical approach to observing the world, then you can see insecurity creep into, you know, your colleagues, the points they raise in academic meetings. You can see it in the way that your friends present themselves on a Friday night when you're heading out for a drink. You can see insecurity when they talk about their future. And, you know, self-analysis is usually a good way in. And I'll be honest, you know, I'm insecure about money. And I realized that I can objectively appraise my insecurity about money. Yeah. And I kind of know where it comes from, and it's tied to my background. And of course, insecurity about money can often be, you know, transferred from other forms of insecurity, perhaps about your identity or your relationship or your place in the world. It can become easily transferred into a concern about money. And of course, those insecurities are with us all the time. And they're a key feature. They're kind of hidden, but they're a fundamental feature of the way that our cultures have developed across the history of capitalism. And so, you know, lots of this, you know, the effects of insecurity, a really useful way of trying to encourage students to, you know, if they get to their dissertation, start doing their first bits of empirical work, to capture, whatever social events they happen to be looking at, and say, well, is it, how might this be, seen in your data set? So there are all those kinds of connections in ultra-realism. I think perhaps we could have been a little bit clearer about it, and I'm relying upon the next generation trying to, conceptualize in an accessible way what we were actually talking about all those years ago in 2015. But I think there are great tools there, and I'm very keen for the next generation to take things forward.
Just picking up on that, Simon, so we talk about kind of ultra-realist criminology. Would it be fair to say that ultra-realism is more than just a criminological theory then? It's a set of tools that allow us to understand the relationship between the individual and the social, between subject and ideology, and that we can apply it in specific contexts to various aspects of criminology and the study of crime and deviance, but it actually allows us to explain a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean, where we both, Steve and I, saw ourselves as criminologists, and criminology was the discipline we spent most of our time. But we were very clear that, rather than the standard criminology tends to think of itself as an importer of ideas from cognate fields. So a lot of the ideas that are dominant in criminology come from liberal sociology. There's a little bit of basic economics, and there's a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of politics in there. But, criminology, the standard idea is that we import ideas. We're just the meeting place discipline. I think one of the things that we wanted to do is to transfer the forms of communication there, and we should be exporting ideas. And so, I think, although ultra-realism is predominantly in the field of crime and deviance, I think it has its framework and its concepts offer social scientists in cognate fields a new and very useful way of grasping problems in civil society, problems in policy formation, policy in traditional fields of psychology and psychoanalytic theory.
Just on the psychoanalytic theory, there's a kind of real, I've felt this myself working with some of these ideas. There's a real suspicion towards psychoanalysis, and you touched on it earlier, and every time you kind of bring it up, it's kind of like there's like whispers, kind of, charlatan, you don't really know what you're talking about, this is just a load of old nonsense. Where I've found it to be a really powerful set of ideas, and there's some real, I think, universal themes that you can touch on there. But what's with the hostility in your eyes towards some of these psychoanalytic ideas within contemporary social sciences, but criminology in particular?
Well, you'll not be surprised to hear that I think the fundamental issue is insecurity.
Yeah, come back to that same theme.
I think lots of criminologists will have had virtually no experience, no exposure to core themes in theoretical psychoanalysis. They may have a kind of textbook understanding of Freud, but I think, I've been at this like 20 odd years, and there are very few academic criminologists that I've ever met who have anything above a very basic understanding of theoretical psychoanalysis. Some of the dismissals of, for instance, Freud, the feminist dismissal of Freud, that he's penis envy and it's just sexism, obviously is nuts, because feminist psychoanalysts have written a huge amount about the utility of Freud. Anna Freud, his daughter, of course, developed a whole range of ideas about the mental systems of defense and how these are played out in gender forms. And I think it's just the sense of insecurity because they don't have the tools necessary to engage in those discussions. They're kind of under-equipped to discuss issues associated with theoretical psychoanalysis. And so rather than do the decent thing and pick up a book and do the work necessary to learn a new, a new range of skills. It's far easier simply to rehearse already existing arguments. To keep ploughing that same furrow, to do another empirical study that finds the same thing that everybody else has discovered, to apply that, moral panic is the classic argument. You will never reach an end point where moral panic is no longer applicable. People are scanning the horizon of the next moral panic so they can produce another argument, another article that makes the same argument. And there's no sense of forward motion at all. And I think it's easier for people to do that. They feel insecure when they're extended, forced to think, and, in some cases brought up short by exposure to a new idea, a new concept. They don't feel, equipped to really drive things forward. And so, we get stuck, this kind of sense of disciplinary stasis where, we're just kind of mulching through the same old stuff over and over again, while out there in the real world, we have new crises bubbling to the surface every day. And rather than kind of accept the impetus to produce something new, to pick up some new concepts that might feel a little unfamiliar at first, but are going to, serve you well, rather than do that, we kind of stuck in our disciplinary silos, the kind of university campus vision of the world, which is totally divorced from the way that most people live. If picking up these new ideas, pushing things forward, should be an integral undertaking for all social scientists, not just for researchers, but also for teachers.
Yeah.
What's new and important, what's out there that can help us explain, for instance, the energy transition, the end of globalization. It might be coming to an end right now.
Yeah.
We see, the rise of ethnocentric nationalism. We see, for Jesus Christ, look at the United States, the forms of cultural enmity that are developing over there.
Yeah.
We need, we need new ideas now more than ever before. And that should be a collective endeavor. It should be all of us chipping in and helping each other to produce better ideas that can explain these things. But the opposite is increasingly true in social science today, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've always been relieved that I stumbled, and it was a real stumble, upon some of these ideas when I was a PhD student. And I was a lucky PhD student on top of that, because I had a studentship with a stipend, so I wasn't having to work or do loads of teaching. I had a stipend that allowed me kind of a basic subsistence level, so I could just read all through my PhD, because it's a lot of work, and I kind of worked backwards. I started with yours and Steve's work, and then I keep seeing this Zizek guy's name keep coming up, so I go, I should go and read some of him. And then he's talking about Lacan and Freud, and so then I kind of worked my way backwards through the layers. I kind of went about it a really arse about face kind of way. If I was encountering this stuff for the first time now, as an academic who's got the day job of teaching however many hours a week, and all the admin and supervision, and you've got to chase funding, and you'd probably just be locked in this kind of static position, and it's kind of everything's working against any kind of forward motion, it feels like. But just in terms of where you see ultra-realism going, or some of the kind of criminological topics you'd like to see it applied to, that you think it could offer something really interesting and new that it hasn't been applied to yet, what might some of those be?
Well, I'm kind of, my own personal career, I'm kind of writing about politics more and more these days, and I've kind of left the theorizing, the criminological theorizing to one side, but I'm more interested with every passing year in serial killers. And I think here there will be a great opportunity to apply ultra-realism the full breadth of ultra-realism in a new, fairly unique way.
See, I find it really interesting.
It's interesting.
Sorry to cut you off. I just find
Isn't
that
it interesting how...
I think we're going to say the same thing. I was going to say it's interesting how...
I was just going to say that...
we keep cutting each other off. I was just going to say how it's...
you go.
I've always found that criminology as a discipline kind of scoffs at that topic. Like it's a less than serious topic. It's this kind of cheap pop criminology that you get on Netflix documentaries and stuff like that. And, you know, real criminologists, serious criminologists won't concern themselves with such things.
It's that question, isn't it, when you talk to somebody and they say, what do you do? And you say you're a criminologist, and they say, so you study serial killers then?
Yeah, no.
And you have to then go and explain why you don't. But
yeah,
maybe now we can.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off there, but
yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, this kind of weird attitude of criminologists, is that kind of extreme violence is somehow not worthy of our best efforts, is a very weird attitude. And I think it, at least in part, of the assumption that proper academic work, proper criminological work now, must always be rooted in activism. It must be politicized, otherwise it's not proper social science. But of course, you know, the damage, the sense that somebody who kills and kills again will have experienced often quite profound forms of damage, actually in a very strange way opens up analysis of broader civil society and trends within our culture. It's not just about, you know, we can in analyzing the most damaged people in our world today, we can actually get a handle on why forms of harm are rolling through Western civil societies. You know, the corrosive forms of culture and enmity and instrumentalism, which are breaking apart the, you know, previously always quite brittle but reasonably collectivist forms of culture. How those things are simply unsustainable now. You know, in analysing extreme forms of violence, it gives us an opportunity to kind of dig into broader themes of social change, I think.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I think maybe the reticence to get involved with topics like that speaks to, coming back to that theme that we've talked about, insecurity, because these individuals who engage in these kind of just inhuman, barbaric acts of violence over and over and over again, they defy explanation in terms of the tools that criminologists and sociologists have been taught and have learned. And so there's a thing of, we're an expert, we are criminologists, we're experts on crime and harm and violence and all the rest of it, yet we can't explain this individual. They defy our ability to explain it. And so it's a kind of thing, well, let's just push it away then, let's just push it to one side and not deal with it, because, you know, we're just not equipped. And so I find that issue of insecurity, again, kind of, we keep returning to it almost compulsively. But just on, I'm just going to shift gears a little bit, because I realise we've been talking for quite a while, and I want to get round to this. On the politics stuff that you've been working on over the last, well, it feels like the last 6-7 years now, you've been talking more and more about politics. You did the book Rise of the Right, obviously, and you've just recently finished, and it's coming out soon for people who are interested, Death of the Left, which is with Policy Press, is it? Yeah, Policy Press. So Death of the Left, could you just discuss briefly the arguments of that book and what relevance? I know it's a book about politics, it doesn't talk about criminology, it's very much a book focused on politics, and all the better for it, but what the relevance of that book might be for criminology moving forward, what we might learn from it.
Sure, yeah. I've always been a socialist as far back as I can remember, and my father was a socialist, and I was exposed to those kind of ideas quite early in my life. Dad was a trade unionist. And of course, as you move into the university, everybody's on the political left. But I think as I've aged, I've become increasingly aware of the close relationship between kind of social science, the forms of theory that have developed in social sciences and humanities, and our political system. So increasingly, to chart the long history of liberal socialism would be too much of a digression. But lots of people listening here, I guess, will be aware of the work of the Frankfurt School, Adorno, but also in this country the kind of the liberal socialists of the new left, people like E.P. Thompson and whatever else. And they have that same kind of, we started off talking about idealism. And E.P. Thompson wrote a great, a really talented historian with great stories to tell. But the overwhelming story that he wants to tell is is an idealization of the working class. The working class are always politically resistant to capitalism. They're always politicized. Everything they do is to a political end. And I think that's a gross mischaracterization of the reality of the working class. In fact, I would love it if the working class was as politically orientated as Thompson maintains that they are. And that kind of liberal social science, that liberal social analysis, runs like a great seam through the history of the university in Britain, especially, I think, especially in the post-war period. A move towards increasing liberalism, substanceless liberalism and idealism, and away from materiality and reality. And I think this has been, real harmful for social science. That in many fields, I don't think we're moving forward, and instead I would kind of characterize lots of social science disciplines as being essentially moribund. They're just a way for middle-class professionals to earn a living teaching already established forms of knowledge to undergraduate students who will then go on and do the same. I don't think, lots of new fields are not producing the forms of new knowledge that they need to sustain themselves. I think there are always excellent work going on in those fields, but it's usually at the margins. It's not driving new developments. And I think this seam of kind of liberal social science is fed into the liberalisation of the political left. The Labour Party in Britain is a perfect example, of course, the one that is perhaps closest to home for me. The Labour Party today have virtually nothing to say about economic matters that cut across cultures and identities. They have nothing to say on political economy. They've got no great policy intervention that they are keen to introduce, which is going to put people back to work in serious, well-paid, socially useful jobs. You've got to imagine that they just accept the current status quo. You've got the radical cultural left who talk about kind of cultural equality, but no one's talking about, and they couldn't care less about economic inequality. It's almost like a fait accompli that we've accepted the injustices of the economic sphere. And instead, we're kind of focusing all our attentions on the inequalities of the cultural sphere. And it's as if, ethnic minority groups or women or, LGBTQ groups aren't working class, which of course there are. They want good jobs too. These are unifying issues that any political leftist political party should be picking up and taking seriously. And I think, generally speaking, the political left now is unelectable. I think the gap between the massed working class, the massed multi-ethnic working class, and the parties that were formed to represent their political interests is now so huge that it is unbreachable. I don't think Labour or the Democratic Party or the socialists in France have any way back to the traditional representation of working class interests. And so I think that the left is dead. I don't think the leftist, generally ostensibly leftist political parties might be elected, but they'll only be elected to introduce a policy program which is not of the traditional left. So the Labour Party might get in because Boris Johnson has messed up, but they're not going to set about nationalising industries or offering a job guarantee or a universal basic income. They're not going to fundamentally change the foundations of civil society at all. They're just going to manage neoliberalism, hopefully a little bit better than the Conservative Party. And I don't think that's anything to be, championed. I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to rush and vote for the Labour Party, because what you get is going to be, even with Keir Starmer in at the next election, will be just a tiny difference between the Labour Party and the current sitting Conservative government. And I think that's an absolute tragedy for our politics, because it's no longer dialectical. Everybody now is, in mainstream politics, is a signed up, dedicated neoliberal. And so in the book, what we do is actually go back, it's for the most part a history book, and we look at how this regrettable situation came about. Why neoliberalism won so profoundly across the political spectrum. How the political spectrum became truncated and squashed to the extent that most of our politicians agree on fundamentals. So the book, there are connections, I think, to social sciences. I think, if we look at, for instance, identity politics, which is developed from the social sciences and humanities, people like Judith Butler and, those kinds of things, Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, these ideas which are wrapped up in identity politics come from the social sciences. And these are ideas that are transforming the Democratic Party. One of the reasons why Sanders failed to secure the Democratic nomination. I don't think they're popular beyond the university campus, beyond urban centres where liberal, metropolitan, middle-class populations gather. I think there are huge swathes of the population who see no great benefit in identity politics. The way that we reach those people is to produce universal policies that they can see a benefit for themselves. So I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear, but I do think there are connections between those two fields. And I guess the disappearance of traditional socialism, a traditional concern with the economic interests of the working class, animates me more than philosophical discussions about the movement of the social sciences across history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded of a psychoanalyst called Todd McGowan, and he draws on Freud and Lacan and people like that, and he says that every social order, every social system is based upon what he calls a missing signifier that kind of drops out and constitutes the social order. So, it's a signifier that you can't have within that social order. So it's always absent. So like patriarchy, for instance, the missing signifier would be gender equality. Yeah, you can't have a patriarchal system and have equality between genders. But within capitalism, obviously, the fundamental kind of absence that it cannot resolve is class inequality. Capitalism always has to be rooted in class inequality. It's the only inequality that capitalism can't resolve. It can't eradicate. And if it did eradicate it, it wouldn't be capitalism anymore. Yeah. So I'm always taken with that, and this, you can eliminate racial inequality, you can eliminate gender inequality, you can eliminate all of these things. The one form of inequality that you cannot eliminate within capitalism is class inequality. And I think it's been missed, and it's been and I think it's true in politics. I think it's true in the social sciences as well, where all of these things are to be looked at on kind of an equal footing, rather than kind of politically and being electorally savvy, rank ordering and going, right, okay, where should we target, and how can, people always talk about the multi-ethnic working class. So let's talk about class then, rather than focusing so heavily upon issues around race to the detriment of your kind of electoral prospects, as it were. But yeah,
I find it interesting. It brings us back full circle to where you started. So this is the context within which. So how has the left capitulated to neoliberalism? What do we know about neoliberalism? Well, it's the studies tell us, the research tells us that it's vastly unequal. Simon Pemberton's work, the most harmful form of capitalism that we've seen. What does that generate? Poverty, deprivation, unemployment, all of these issues that are the core of social science, to hollow out the communities within which the violence, criminal markets that you started your career looking at kind of exist within. So in order to fully understand what's happening at the micro level within those communities, we need to understand the political context within which this has happened. And I think obviously the prognosis is not great on the political front in terms of the capitulation of the left, but it does, for me, it kind of brings us all the way back round to that starting point and understanding those kind of core kind of criminological issues again.
Yeah, I think, if we look back at the history of capitalism, the only force that even placed any kind of brake on the development of capitalism has been the collectivist working class. When we overlook our idiosyncratic differences, our cultural differences, when we recognize that you and me and him and her and whoever else have got things in common, and we join together and form a force to advance our common interests, then we have something which is a degree of political power, which allows us to intervene in history and push things in a different direction. And the great high point for the left is, of course, the social democratic era that followed the Second World War, which is rooted in collectivism. And now, of course, the entire idea of that kind of collectivist political attitude is almost impossible to sustain, because it seems to run counter to our obsession with individualism, our own personal interests, which we become increasingly obsessed about and has been kind of artificially manufactured through the culture industries for generations. So this is what we need to discover. If the left's going to be successful, it needs to move away from individualism and identity and towards collectivism.
Last question, and we'll finish on this. And it's actually a question I don't think I've ever asked you, and I'm quite intrigued to hear your response. Certain theoretical frameworks within criminology necessitate a kind of politics. Yeah. Feminist criminology being the very obvious one. Yeah, it necessitates a commitment to a feminist politics. Whether that's, what wave of feminist politics that is up for debate, but there's a certain politics there. Is the same true of ultra-realism? Does ultra-realism necessitate a certain politics, or is there no political program necessarily attached to ultra-realism? And does it particularly matter? I guess it's just a question that popped into my head as you were talking there.
What a great question. I think, generally speaking, kind of ultra-realism falls on the kind of left half of the political spectrum. But whether or not that needs to be the case, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps I would immediately argue and extend my argument that I made earlier, that we're kind of try and be as objective as we can be with regard to our analysis of the social world. There's no great requirement for us to be on the political left. It's entirely possible that you could have, a traditional conservative adopt the ideas of ultra-realism and put them to work explaining whatever it is he or she is interested in. I don't know, I'm not sure. Perhaps that's something I'm going to have to mull a little bit. I would like to suggest that ultra-realism is committed to objective social analysis first and foremost. But that may not be the case. That may just see this as me engaging in self-analysis now. That may just be wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I wasn't necessarily expecting. I was intrigued to what you were saying. I don't really know the answer myself. I've thought about it quite a lot in terms of ultra-realism's understanding of subjectivity and how that shapes things, and how that perhaps shapes certain political standpoints. But actually, I think you're right. There is nothing that prevents. I think this is kind of what makes it quite a unique perspective as well, is that there's nothing that actually prevents a diehard socialist and a more conservative thinker, traditionally philosophical conservatism, I mean, working from the same kind of theoretical perspective, perhaps in quite different ways, but drawing upon the same broad framework and scaffolding, if you will, that ultra-realism provides. So yeah, thank you for having a stab at that. I apologise to leave probably the most difficult question to the end. So I think that's all we've got time for. I really appreciate you coming along, Simon. It's been great having a chat. I'm sure listeners will have found that interesting and illuminating. And thanks, Santh, as well, for joining us as well, co-hosting this. So yeah, thank you very much for coming along.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much.
No worries. Okay, thank you guys for listening. We'll be posting on Twitter as to when the next pod will be out. Remember to hit like and subscribe at the button, and we will see you next time.